at the Senior Center. I want to welcome you all to the Veterans Day program. And yes, there are 4 seats right here in front of me. If you're looking for a seat and you want to make yourself obvious, come on up and have a seat. Today, we're very lucky to have Bob Block talk about prisoner of war camps in Wisconsin. How many of you knew that we have them here? Yeah, okay, that's great. Just a couple questions. First of all, thank you, all the veterans who are here and all who are from the Oregon area that are not here. We really, really appreciate your service. And I'd like to know, just raise your hand, how many Army veterans? All right. Navy? All right. Marines? Well, Roger, you're the one Marine here. Air Force? Oh, got a few of those. All right. National Guard? Oh, the speaker from earlier. Coast Guard? Any Coast Guard? Don't have a lot of coast here. And here's the big one, Space Force? Well, thank you so much for coming. Bob Block is going to do his talk now, and he can tell you a little bit about himself.
All right, well, welcome. Today we're going to talk about prisoner of war camps. Many people are not aware of the fact that Wisconsin actually had POW camps during World War II, and they're very surprised to find out that we actually had 39 of them. When we talk about war, we need to talk about the consequences of war, which are death, destruction, and POWs. The U.S. had 511 area POW camps and 175 branch camps. Every state had POW camps except for Nevada, North Dakota, Vermont, Alaska, and Hawaii. California had the most camps with 110. Texas was second with 80. Wisconsin had 39. If we look at this map, it gives you some idea where these camps were scattered throughout the United States. These are the 511 area camps and 175 branch camps. Notice that they are concentrated to the south because it was cheaper to put up a tent encampment than it was to put up a wooden building, and heating costs was considerably less in the south. If we add to this additional branch camps and medical facilities that held POWs, there were over 1,000 locations in the U.S. having POWs. There were over 425,000 POWs in the United States, consisting mostly of Germans, Japanese, and Italians. During that time, there were 477 POWs that died nationwide, 265 natural deaths, 72 suicides, 43 traffic accidents, 17 drownings. 14 POWs were found guilty of murdering another POW. They were tried and hung. According to my research or what I saw, I was not aware of any POWs that were killed by the military. Today's presentation is based on this book, Stalag, Wisconsin, which is the Inside World War II Prisoner of War Camps by Betty Colley. Betty Colley was a history teacher in Altoona, Wisconsin. Her students were very surprised and didn't believe her when she told them that there were POWs in Altoona. Upon her retirement, she began her research to write this book, Stalag, Wisconsin. Information was difficult to find. The National Archives destroyed the records of the branch camps in the 1950s. Many of the smaller communities that had a POW camp either had no paper or the local paper, any stories relating to the war and POWs was censored. In addition to doing the research, she also interviewed over 300 people, which were either a POW, they may have worked with a POW, or they lived in a community that had a POW camp. The largest POW camp in Wisconsin was Camp McCoy, which was within Fort McCoy. This was a 20-acre site with 30 to 35 buildings surrounded by a double 8-foot cyclone fence, having guard towers, guards, and guard dogs. The POWs cooked their own meals in their own kitchen, they had their own mess hall, they had their own shower facilities, they maintained their barracks and the ground. They were essentially self-sufficient. The Camp McCoy opens early in 1942. It's the first camp to open in Wisconsin. It remains open continuously until it closes in June of 1946. At one time or another, there were as many as 5,000 German POWs, 3,500 Japanese POWs, and 500 Korean POWs. Camp McCoy had the largest number of Japanese POWs in the entire United States. Let's talk about Ensign Sakamaki. Sakamaki was one of 10 sailors picked by the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941 in 5 two-man mini-subs. 9 of those 10 people were killed. Sakamaki's sub ran onto 2 coral reefs and sank. He attempted to sabotage his sub with explosives, but they failed to go off. His crewmate drowned. He makes it to shore and is unconscious and found the next day by a U.S. soldier. He becomes the first POW in the United States on December 8, 1941. He eventually makes his way to the U.S. and he enters Camp McCoy on March 9th of 1942, where he remains until the end of the war. His mini-sub tours the United States in an effort to raise war bonds. There was some resistance at the camp, and they tended to be territorial. That is, the Germans stayed with the Germans, the Japanese with the Japanese, and they did not get along with each other. But even within ethnic groups, the Nazis did not get along with the non-Nazis. The Nazis were the party members. They would intimidate, harass, and even kill the non-Nazis who were not party members. The Japanese, the Navy and Army POWs were both dedicated to the Emperor, but they did not get along with each other. There were more Navy POWs than Army, so they tended to control the camps. The Koreans didn't like the Japanese at all. Japan had conquered Korea during the war, and they had forced them into the military to fight the war. The most difficult group to manage at the camps were the Japanese, because their military honor code said they should do nothing to help the enemy, and they should fight to the death. So they were suicidal. Camp McCoy had 5 Japanese suicides. And Ensign Sakamaki attempted suicide 4 times. There were 14 Japanese and 4 Germans that escaped Camp McCoy, but they were all quickly captured and returned. Most of them simply accepted their life and awaited their return to their homeland. They knew they had it pretty good. They had shelter, clothing, food. They had opportunities to work, to keep themselves occupied and physically fit, and they certainly weren't being bombed or shot at. One German POW said if he'd known they were going to have such Hilton quality conditions, having beds with mattresses and blankets and pillows, he would have surrendered sooner rather than sleeping on top of his tank, fighting until they had run out of ammunition. These are the branch camps that were in Wisconsin, ranging from Antigo to Hortonville and Janesville to Wisconsin Rapids. I'll put the slide up again at the end of the presentation so you can see if you may have grown up or lived or worked in an area that may have had a POW camp. This is a map that shows you those branch camps as they were spread across Wisconsin. If you add what I refer to as sub-branch camps, like the Goldman and Miller Orchards in Door County, there are as many as 48 locations holding POWs. The earliest camps, there were 15 of them that were opened in June of 1944. The last camp to open was Camp Rhinelander, which opened in August of 1945. The smallest camp was Camp Mayfield with 125 POWs. The 2 largest branch camps were Camp Billy Mitchell, which which is now Mitchell International Airfield, with 3,000 POWs, and then Camp Sturgeon Bay with 2,140 POWs. The last two camps to close were Camp Fox Lake in Hartford, which closed in January of 1946. There were two camps, Camp Jefferson and Camp Lake Kesis. They were only open for 1 month, from June to July of 1944. Many of the camps were only open for a period of 2 months, which would be the harvesting and canning season. There were a few of them that were open for extended times, from say 12 to 18 months. These were camps that had work other than seasonal work, such as dairy farms, dairy or milk processing plants, or other businesses. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention and Red Cross Accords, POWs could be used for labor. The work must not be directly related to the war effort. POW officers could not be forced to work. And POWs must be paid for their labor. So they were paid at a rate of 80 cents a day in camp script, which could only be used at camp canteen. However, in addition to that, they received 10 cents a day, I paid, 10 cents a day in gratuity. This money was saved and accumulated, and upon release, they were given this money in the form of cash. Businesses that used POWs paid the going hourly wage rate. So if they were paying their employees 30 cents an hour, that is what they paid for the POW labor. Based on this, the government collected millions of dollars in POW labor, which easily offset the cost of operating POW camps and helped reduce the cost of the war efforts. The kind of work that the POWs did was harvesting of different crops, picking at orchards, lumbering, dairies, farming, canneries, industrial factories, tanneries. Pretty much anywhere where labor was needed or necessary, you may have found POWs working. Where did you find the POW camps? Will they be on fairgrounds and the buildings on those fairgrounds, tent encampments, farms, cannery property, military bases, government buildings? In other words, almost in any location. This is an example of Camp Bayfield, which is their county courthouse and community center. The POWs slept in the gymnasium on the 2nd floor. They took showers in the basement, and their kitchen and their mess hall was on the main floor. Security here, 2 guards out front, and a picket fence across the back of the building to keep the curious out. Camp Reedsburg, this is an example of a tent encampment. Camp Plymouth is a fairgrounds encampment. The building on the right is where the POWs were housed. The tent was the kitchen and the mess hall. While a few of the branch camps had chain link fencing, many of them had nothing more than either a snow or picket fence around them to mark the boundaries of the camp. The fencing wasn't there to keep the POWs from escaping. The fencing was there to keep the civilians and the curious out of the camp. They did not want the POWs and the civilians intermingling. Happened at some camps, but they didn't want that to happen. As the war goes on, many of the encampments had no fencing or security at all. However, they all would have military guards. This is Camp Swartz in Hartford, Wisconsin. This is where the big bands like Lawrence Welk, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, and so forth would come and perform. You know, they did that here in Wisconsin. This camp was open year-round because in addition to seasonal crops, they had milk and dairy processing plants and other year-round work. This camp, like many of the camps, harvested hemp for rope. Wisconsin was one of the largest hemp producers during World War II. An interesting story at this camp was a local farmer would come and pick up the food waste to feed to his pigs, and he complained about the amount of food being wasted. So the camp commander decided to just get around that farmer by purchasing 3 of his own pigs and feeding them to food waste, and eventually the pigs were fed to the POWs. In 1945, this camp made $250,182 for the government on POW labor. Interestingly enough, after the war, the big bands never came back. Well, what about some of the other branch camps? I'll give you a few of the stories related to them. Camp Antidote. At a farm, the German POWs were taking a lunch break, and the farm family gave them corn to eat, which they refused to eat, because that was swine food. Same thing at another farm. But in this case, they buttered and salted it and gave it to the Germans, and they ate it and they liked it. And they wanted to know if they could have some of that dried corn seed to take with them when they returned home. I can relate to this story because my father-in-law was of German descent and grew up on a farm in Wisconsin. He refused to eat corn because that's what they fed to fatten the pigs. So I relate to it. Camp Fox Lake. There was a civilian who was standing outside the fence of the camp watching the POWs. One of the POWs approached him and said, "Why aren't you in the military fighting the war?" And the civilian said, "Well, I'm only 16. The POW said, "I'm 15. The youngest age that I saw in my research here was 14. Camp Fredonia. The POWs were exposed to new foods like Jell-O that they had never seen or tasted before. Another new food was apple pie. Camp Galesville, one of the more interesting stories. Staff Sergeant Cramp, one of 16 out of 287 in his unit to survive the Battle of the Bulge. He's captured and he's a POW, but he manages to escape. At one point, he's down to 60 pounds, begins his recovery overseas, eventually ends up at a medical facility in Chicago. He's given a leave of absence and goes to his hometown of Galesville. Decides to go out one night to some of his old hangouts and hot spots, in this case it's called Coffee Cup, and he's shocked as he goes in to find German POWs and military guards with their rifles against the wall having a beer. He races home, grabs his Winchester rifle, goes back to the Coffee Cup, lines up the POWs and the military guards, and marches them back to camp. They peacefully get things settled. He eventually returns to Chicago, and the POWs are never allowed in downtown Galesville again. Camp Green Lake, another really interesting story. This camp was on the Lawson Farm. You might know it today as the Lawsonia Golf Course, one of the highly rated golf courses in the Midwest. In this situation, there was an immigrant German family that had settled in Milwaukee, and they operated the Deutschland Dairy. The mother decided to take her 16-year-old son and baby daughter to Germany to visit the grandparents. While there, the Germans confiscate the 16-year-old's passport and draft him into the military, where he becomes a paratrooper, and he jumps into the war over Cyprus and then quickly surrenders to the Allies. He ends up as a POW, and he ends up in Camp Green Lake, where he tries to let them know that he's a U.S. citizen, and they tend to believe that he probably is, but they still treat him as a POW. At the end of the war, they don't release him. They repatriate him back to Germany, where he again appeals his case as a U.S. citizen, and eventually he's granted a visa and returns to the U.S. Camp Lake Kesis. This is the one that is only open for 1 month, and was probably the most posh of all the POW camps because this was a fairly classy resort. It actually had a beach with changing rooms and showers. It had a kitchen and a restaurant, and it had a dance hall where the POWs resided in bunks stacked 4 high, doing a fair amount of damage just through wear and tear of the dance floor. It was also reported that the owner's wife's chickens were stolen by the POWs. And perhaps that's why he did not renew his contract with the military the next year. Camp Sheboygan was an interesting one in that in looking for a location, they decided to use the abandoned Sheboygan County Asylum. Nice facility, it had plenty of room, it had kitchen and showers, so that worked out well for them. And that asylum was assumed to be haunted at that time and even to today. Camp Sturgeon Bay actually consisted of 7 different sites, the largest being at the fairgrounds in Sturgeon Bay. The other 6 were like the Goldman and Miller orchards spread out through Door County. At those orchard sites, the POWs would either stay in tents or they would stay in the building barracks meant for the pickers or the immigrants that would normally have been hired to pick the crops. It is said that the POWs saved the Wisconsin 1945 cherry crop. The combination of the orchards picked a total of 508,020 pails of cherries, earning the government a total of $101,064. Well, just as a little sidelight here, I want to just finish up here with perhaps the best known German Stalag camp. This camp existed for 6 continuous years. It had held Allied POWs, which were mostly Americans. It was the only German Stalag that never had escaped. And millions of Americans have probably actually seen this Stalag on TV because it was Stalag 13, which was the home of Hogan's Heroes. The main characters were Colonel Klink, Sergeant Schultz, American Colonel Hogan, Frenchman Corporal LeBeau, American Sergeant Kinchlow, American Sergeant Carter, and British Corporal Newkirk. The show ran from 1965 to 1971, filmed 168 episodes. Interestingly, the 4 German characters here, Klink, Schultz, General Burkhalter seated, and Major Hochstetter to the right. The 4 men playing these roles were all Jewish. Klink, Schultz, and Burkhalter actually escaped Nazi Germany. Frenchman Corporal LeBeau survived internment at a German concentration camp. If you watch the show, you would normally or often see General Burkhalter arriving or departing in this vehicle, which was a 1938 G4 Mercedes-Benz Model 31. It was meant to be an off-road vehicle. You would often see either pictures or movies of Hitler standing in the back of one of these vehicles during military parades. Only 57 of these vehicles were ever manufactured from 1931 to 1939, and only 3 survived the war. This is the one that survived and ended up in Hollywood and on Hogan's Heroes. Well, after 6 years of internment, all of the Allied POWs at Stalag 13 were released and repatriated with their home country. Again, if you are interested in any additional information, I highly recommend that you get the book Stalag, Wisconsin to learn more and for further enlightenment. I'll finish up here by, again, leaving this slide listing the 38 POW camps, and I'll leave that up there so that you can have an opportunity to look at that list to see, again, if you may have been raised, worked, or lived in an area that once held POW camps. There are very few reminders of these POW camps, maybe a plaque. The only one that you may find any significant amount of material left would be Camp McCoy. I will end here, and if you have any questions, come on up afterwards, and I will be glad to try and answer those for you. Thank you.